Back to today's video. Today is Tuesday, July 29th, 2025, and today we are going to be talking about Donald Trump's approval rating amongst young voters across this country. Now, Donald Trump in the last presidential election won for a variety of different reasons. Some pretty massive shifts amongst Latino voters, Black voters, Asian voters across the country. And in terms of overall turnout, Donald Trump just had better turnout in rural areas than Democrats did in suburban and urban regions. But one thing that I think that we talk about a bit, but not enough, is how the youth electorate actually seemed to have shrunk in favor of the Democratic Party in a way that benefited Donald Trump in this past cycle. Now, young voters in the last election did favor Kamala Harris. She won young voters, and that's something that should not be lost on this. That yes, Democrats did in fact win young voters in every single battleground state, as well as the fact that they benefited from young voters in college towns, in urban areas, but it did not do enough. And a big reason for that was because although young voters did want Kamala Harris more, a huge section of them that used to back Democrats to the greatest degree ended up backing Donald Trump in this election cycle way more than they had in the past two elections, 2020 and 2016. And this young voter shift was something that was documented pretty much all across the board. We saw that young voters did give Biden his victory back in 2020. They mobilized, they turned out, but in 2024, they played a part in how Donald Trump won. And it was that, change in youth support that gave Donald Trump way more support than he had up against Hillary Clinton or Joe Biden that really started to show you exactly why young voters this time around, it's so important to look when they start to sour on the president of the United States. Now, we didn't start off with super high numbers amongst young voters in the beginning. Obviously, like I said, he had not been winning voters aged 18 to 29, and you can see that in the research from Pew Research. In 2016, they backed Hillary Clinton by about 30 points. They backed Biden by about 26 points. But in the 2024 election, voters ages 18 to 29 ended up backing Kamala Harris by a margin of just 19 points. She did about 11 points worse on the overall net than Hillary Clinton, who also lost her election. And when you take a look at the data in terms of voters that have been born in certain decades, they do the data this way: 1930s, 1940s, 50s, all the way up to the 1990s and 2000s. Hillary Clinton won voters that were born in the 1990s and 2000s by about 37 percentage points. In 2024, for Kamala Harris, that advantage went down to about 13 points, a massive, massive reduction. And so looking ahead to the approval rating of Donald Trump and the way that many voters view him, he actually started off in office with about a plus 12% net approval. And a lot of that actually was young voters that were open to the idea of a second Trump presidency, that they started to approve of the way that Donald Trump had handled his office. And even though they had voted against him in the last cycle, his approval rating was a lot better than it is today. And you can find those numbers to be dramatically different, as we now see that the approval rating of Trump amongst voters ages 18 to 29 in February of 2025 was 55 points. 55% of young voters said, "I approve of the job that Donald Trump is doing." By the time you reached this month, July of 2025, just 28% of young voters say the same thing. Now, this change here is about 27%. The change amongst other demographic groups, broken down by age, 30 to 44, was just 11%. 45 to 64, just 6%. And voters ages 65 plus, a change of just 3%. The most influential change, and the most noticeable one, comes directly from young voters that are responsible for driving down Trump's approval rating to this degree. Going from plus 12 in January, 6 months later, down to -8. It's a very bad place to be if you are Donald Trump. And a lot of it has to do with the way that voters view him from a youth perspective. Because taking a look at other data points too, The Economist and YouGov did a more recent poll. They released this one yesterday where they asked voters favorability of elected officials Donald Trump. Now, in the overall, 56% of respondents say they view Donald Trump unfavorably. 41% say it's favorable. But broken down by age and demographic, you'll find that it is young voters that disapprove of Donald Trump to the greatest degree. 66% of voters aged 18 to 29 disapprove of the job that Donald Trump is doing. That's in contrast with just 56% of voters aged 30 to 44, 51% amongst the voting group 45 to 64, and 65 plus, 54% disapprove. So everybody does disapprove, but it's young voters, again, that are driving down that total number in a way that makes a huge difference on the overall net. Because if you add everything else up and throw it into the average, Donald Trump ends up with a much better approval rating than what he has right now. But again, it is those young voters that really move it. And it is young voters that are now abandoning Donald Trump. This is an article I covered back in May that sort of showed us the warning signs for the Trump administration around young voters, that Latino voters, independent voters were souring on Trump, but so were young voters that gave him the benefit of the doubt when he first came into office. That's what happened here. A lot of these young voters actually had Donald Trump at a higher approval than voters in the age group that now disapprove of him less than young voters do. Right, they had a higher approval of Trump than voters aged 30 to 44, ages 65 plus, but in terms of what has changed, it's young voters that have been the most elastic, going from a huge approval to a huge disapproval. And I think in a way you can sort of explain this as a lot of older voters actually lived through 2 full Trump presidencies, right? Or are living through a second one for the first time, but 2 full campaign cycles with Donald Trump being in office and 1 full Trump presidency. So a lot of what they've heard and said being used against Trump is nothing new to the campaign trail. It's something that they understood and took into account well before the ballot had even opened between him and Kamala Harris. And that's a big reason why a lot of these same attacks really didn't mobilize a lot of voters against Donald Trump. As well as the fact that, too, a lot of these older voters look at this and say, okay, well, I saw Trump act the same exact way during the first term. I'm not really that shocked that he's doing the tariffs or he's doing X, Y, and Z across the country because this is the Trump that I knew. I think in the 2024 election, Donald Trump took on a slightly new persona that seemed a little bit more, especially post-assassination attempt and post-RNC, took a more optimistic view to some degree. Obviously, very negative campaign overall, but a lot more focused on some of those more kitchen table issues that a lot of voters, especially young voters, wanted to hear about, felt like it resonated with them. And not to say that Kamala Harris didn't talk about them, but Donald Trump clearly won the election and left that election improving his approval rating amongst young voters. I mean, the campaign never really ended for Donald Trump. It continued and continues today through his presidency. But voters don't seem to like what he's doing. But older voters seem to be more used to the way that Donald Trump goes from running an election to actually being in office and using the bully pulpit and the office of the presidency to practically do whatever he wants. And when I think about the way that a lot of these young voters, again, swinging towards Trump in the last election are now souring on him, could mean doom for the Republicans in the 2026 midterm elections. The 2024 presidential race went in favor of the Republican Party largely because of a combination of swings. Multiple things happening all at once benefiting Donald Trump. Again, you see the reversion not just in predominantly Latino areas or in areas with high Asian American populations and highly more rural areas. You're seeing a lot of those shifts too, but a lot of it comes too. A lot of these college towns, you're finding a rightward shift amongst those voting groups, right? Voters that previously backed Democrats and were the reason why some of these states even voted in favor of the Democratic Party. When I think specifically too, you're talking about areas like Ann Arbor that did see some minor shifts in favor, right, of Donald Trump. That cannot be understated in a state that was won in some degree, sometimes by, in this case it was more, but in 2016 he won it by roughly 11,000 votes. This time around, less than 100,000 votes. On the margins, these shifts, especially amongst young voters, can really, really make a difference. And even if Donald Trump isn't necessarily turning out young voters, if they feel disaffected enough by the system that they won't turn out and vote, but they otherwise would be voting for the Democratic Party, that is a lost vote and benefits Donald Trump tremendously, right? So when you see a lot of young voters out there saying, I'm not going to vote, I don't care, it doesn't impact me, I'm just one vote, what's going to make a difference? If those were otherwise Democratic voters, which in most cases they actually are, just based on the way the youth electorate breaks up, that benefits the Republican Party because Donald Trump was not only changing minds, but equally mobilizing his base. And when you see how voters actually changed in the last election, it really does show exactly why. A lot of Democrats are looking to see how do they get these voters back in future elections, right? When you're looking at the shifts in some of these battleground states, so I can actually, find what the data is saying. One of these has it, I swear to you. Here we are. In key swing states, Harris lost support from voters under 30. You can see this in the exit polls. Besides Georgia, every state losing support relative to the last election. And some of the most egregious amounts of lost support came from states like Michigan, where a lot of this wasn't just driven by voters changing their mind and voting for Trump, but by a lot of voters that came out there and said, I'm not voting at all. And yes, I voted for Biden in 2020, and in some cases voted for Clinton in 2016. But this time around in specific, did not feel a call to action that resonated enough with them to turn out and vote in the election. And whether or not you agree with their take, their vote made a huge difference, as you find that Donald Trump improving by 24 points amongst young voters in Michigan is a big reason why this is the biggest victory we've seen for Michigan for any candidate since Obama. The Donald Trump winning here, you're finding, or I guess underperformed Biden, but better than every other Republican, you're going to find too, looking at these battleground states, it isn't just Michigan. In Pennsylvania, Donald Trump was able to do well. This is the state I meant to say where you're going to find these numbers were better than any candidate since Obama. In Wisconsin, a 15-point swing in favor of Trump. In North Carolina, a 14-point swing. I don't have to keep continuing. Georgia is that shining beacon of hope for Democrats there, and I think that makes actually a lot of sense. We found the Atlanta metro area really boomed and still increased turnout, and also relative to a lot of other states, shifted by some of the smallest amounts relative to the last election. So Georgia definitely a target for Democrats in the future, but the point is not Georgia. The point is on the broad strokes. Every data point tells us Harris did worse amongst young voters, but now they are saying we're done with Trump. And it really is interesting because as I look to the 2026 election, I see exactly how Donald Trump and the Republican Party fall apart. Because the coalition that ushered them into 2024 was a very strong and certainly a winning coalition. But it takes a lot to keep those voters in. Voters in the middle preferred Trump. We saw massive swings amongst every demographic group, but specifically Latino voters, massive shifts in favor of Trump. And young voters too. And that's why this article from back in May from the Cook Political Report is so resonant today. Because it isn't just that they soured on Trump in May of 2025 and never again. They continue to sour on him, and his numbers only get worse amongst young, Latino, and independent voters. The exact coalition that, in a perfect storm and in a perfect scenario, ushers in a victory as impressive as this one for Donald Trump. But if not maintained, and it very much looks like Donald Trump and his administration does not have the capacity to maintain it, falls apart by the next election. And I'm not just talking about the midterms. I'm talking about the next presidential election where you throw in J.D. Vance or Marco Rubio and expect the same exact results. Because what Donald Trump showed us, I think, contrary to what a lot of Democrats believe, is that he actually isn't that easy to beat. He does a very good job at completely turning around any and every story that comes about him in the media, mobilizing his base, not having as much of an on-the-ground effort as Democrats need to outcompete in order to come even close to victory in this election. I mean, I think about the amount of doors the Harris campaign knocked on in contrast with the Trump campaign, and you would think that running it based off who has the most ground game, Harris would have won the election, but that wasn't the case because Donald Trump in itself and his whole persona is a mobilization, right? He's able to mobilize the base to a degree that other Republicans like Romney and McCain simply were not. And even in the 2020 election, when the cards were largely stacked up against him, his performance was still quite strong relative to what the data had predicted, what the circumstances of the national environment had predicted. And then come 2024, wins by a larger margin than 2016, and a lot of it has to do with young voters in specific. So now as they sour on Trump and lead his approval rating down to some of the lowest points we have seen it of this second term and getting worse, it really shows that by 26, I do think Democrats do better amongst young voters like they have done in years past. Because I think a lot of young voters coming new into this election, coming out of college, voting for the first time, being engaged for the first time, might have felt like Donald Trump was speaking to them. That he talked about the things they cared about, that he was focused on the things that they cared about, but now are feeling burned. A lot of voters who get a lot of their information from social media and online presences where you're seeing the reversion in support away from Donald Trump and the Republican Party. Whether it's the podcast hosts that they watch or their favorite gym influencer souring on Trump because of tariffs, whatever it might be, there are a lot of reasons as to why Donald Trump's approval rating is really dropping amongst young voters. And I don't want to say they're an entire monolith because there's a variety of different reasons as to why these young voters are souring on Trump in a way that many other demographic groups simply are not, at least not to this extent. But I do think it makes a difference. And I do think it will likely provide Democrats the necessary environment to win in 2026. And while I don't think young voters will be the only story to be told about Donald Trump's administration really pushing away his base and those who elected him in the first place, I do think that this is a big part of it. The young voters who gave Donald Trump the upper hand in 2024, and not alone, but in part, and were a huge piece of the puzzle, might not even be an option for J.D. Vance or Marco Rubio or any other Republican in 2028 because of the way that Donald Trump is handling issues that a lot of young voters care about to this day and cared about in the last election and will care about come November of 2026 and November of 2028. So young voters are going to be a huge piece of this. I'm very interested to see exactly what happens here and how they change their minds or back Democrats, back Republicans, especially in these battleground states, because these will be the groups to watch. The groups that Donald Trump took from Biden in 2020 and shifted them dramatically in 2024, the Democrats might want to work back in 2028 and especially 2026. And so we'll see what happens, what the targeting looks like, what's the information ecosystem that's going up over the next 4 years. Will it be more pro-Trump? Will it be more anti-Trump? We will see. A lot of it is evolving as we talk about it. And young voters right now who seem to be very solidly in the Trump camp in February of 2025 are now entirely against him in July of 2025. In just a few short 5-6 months, a lot can change in American politics, and a lot will change between now and November 2026. So keep your eyes peeled, watch the young voting electorate, watch how these groups of voters change and adapt with politics, because chances are Republicans will fare a lot worse amongst them in 2026, and Democrats will benefit. But not everything is predictable in American politics. A lot can change. A lot will change. So again, as I've said for the 10th time now, keep your eyes peeled. It'll be a very fascinating midterm election. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the top left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video for you to watch, and then a playlist for my second Trump administration analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all tomorrow.